The day my fiancée told me she needed a pause should have been the best Wednesday of my life. I had just gotten off a call confirming that our offer on a house in Westchester had been accepted. A 4-bedroom colonial with a covered porch and a yard big enough for a dog. I was standing in the parking lot of my office building with a stupid grin on my face, about to call her with the news, when she texted me first. "Can you come home early? We need to talk." Those 5 words hit differently when you're holding news that was supposed to change both your lives. I drove home with the house documents still sitting on my passenger seat. My fiancée was on the couch when I walked in, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. The TV was off, the blinds were pulled. She looked like someone who had rehearsed what she was about to say 100 times and still wasn't ready. She looked up at me, and I knew immediately, not from her eyes, from the way she didn't smile. She had always smiled when I walked in. She said, "I need to talk to you about something important." And then she asked me to sit down. I put the house papers on the coffee table face down. I don't know why, some instinct maybe. She started talking about feeling unsettled. About questions she hadn't been able to shake. About how the engagement had moved fast. I'd proposed 8 months ago after 4 years together. And how lately she'd been waking up at 3 in the morning just lying there, thinking. I listened. We'd had conversations like this before. Pre-wedding anxiety, her therapist had called it. Normal, she had said. Totally normal. Then she said the name. Tyler reached out to me a few weeks ago. My stomach dropped out from under me. Tyler was her ex. They'd dated for almost 2 years in grad school before he ended it. She had told me the story early in our relationship. How he'd said he wasn't ready for anything serious, how she'd been wrecked by it, how she eventually moved on. She had told me she was glad it ended because it led her to me. I had believed every word of that. I asked what he wanted. She said he'd been going through a divorce. That he'd been doing a lot of reflecting. That he'd reached out to apologize and reconnect. "And you've been talking to him," I said. Not a question. She nodded. How long? About 6 weeks. 6 weeks. While she'd been picking out wedding invitation fonts with me. While we'd been driving up to Connecticut to look at venues. While I'd been submitting the offer on the house in Westchester and imagining where we'd put a porch swing. 6 weeks of parallel lives, and I had not known. I didn't raise my voice, I couldn't find it. The air had left the room. "What does he want?" I asked again. She looked down at the mug in her hands. "He wants to try again." I sat with that for a moment. The clock on the wall made a sound, it never seemed to make any other time. "And what do you want?" She didn't answer right away. Which was its own kind of answer. "I think I need some time to figure out if there's still something there," she finally said. She met my eyes. "And if there isn't, I'll come back to you, and we can move forward. Like none of this happened." I want you to understand exactly how those words landed. Not the first part. The part about Tyler, about needing time, about something being there. The last part. "I'll come back to you, and we can move forward like none of this happened." As if I were a hotel room she could put on hold. As if 4.5 years of my life were a calendar event. She could reschedule at her convenience. I asked her, "What exactly do you think happens to me while you figure this out?" She said, "I thought you'd understand." Something involuntary happened in my chest. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. I looked at this woman I was supposed to marry in 6 months. This woman whose name was on the lease I'd co-signed for a storage unit. To hold our combined furniture. While we waited on the house closing. This woman who 3 weeks ago had sent me a photo of herself in her wedding dress with tears running down her face. Because it fit perfectly. And what I saw was not guilt, it was not fear, it was quiet expectation. She genuinely believed I would say okay. I stood up. "What are you doing?" she asked. I walked to the bedroom and took her overnight bag down from the top shelf of the closet. The one she used for work trips. I set it on the bed. She followed me in, and stopped in the doorway. She said my name. Just that. I said, "I'm not going to be your backup option." "No," she said, "that's not what this is, I just need a little time to." "You want to go see if your ex still feels right," I said. "And then you want to come back if he doesn't. That is what you are asking me." She opened her mouth. Closed it. I said, "I need you to pack what you need for a few days and go." The look on her face was something I will never fully be able to explain. Not because she seemed hurt, because she seemed genuinely surprised. Like, she had walked through a door she had opened 100 times before, and found the room rearranged. She packed slowly. She kept saying she wasn't choosing him, that she just needed space to think. That I was making it into something it wasn't. I held the front door open. She walked out still saying she would call me tomorrow. I said. Please don't. The door closed. The apartment went quiet. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Long enough for the street noise outside to cycle through its full rhythm. A car, someone's dog, a bus, silence, a car again. I looked at the house papers on the coffee table. I had been 30 seconds from calling her, with the best news of our year. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in a bed that still smelled like her shampoo and stared at the ceiling, and went back through the last 6 weeks, looking for what I had missed. Had she been distant? Sometimes, yes. I had explained it away. She had a big performance review coming up. I had been buried in a complicated commercial project on the west side of the city. We had been ships in the dark. I thought. Maybe that had been exactly the point. The next morning I called my friend Dex. He had been my closest friend since our early 20s. The kind of person you call first without thinking about whether you should. He answered on the second ring. She asked me to wait while she figures things out with her ex. I told him. There was a long pause. He said, "What did you say to her?" I told her to leave. Another pause. Longer this time. He said, "Good." I waited for more. There wasn't more, just that one word. Good. I drove to his place that afternoon, and we sat on his back porch with coffee that got cold. And at some point he said the thing I keep coming back to. He said, "You know what I hate most about this? Not what she did. What she assumed it said about you. That you'd sit there and wait." That hit harder than I expected. Here's the thing about being the reliable one. People start to confuse reliability with availability. They think because you've always been steady, always showed up, always found a way to make it work. They think that means you can absorb anything. That your steadiness is a resource that doesn't run out, that you can be counted on, even when you're being counted out. I had been that person my entire relationship with her. The one who adjusted, the one who solved things, the one who said, "It'll be okay," and then quietly went and made it okay. She had counted on that person to still be standing there, waiting. She hadn't counted on the version of me that finally understood what I'd been doing. 3 days after she left, I called the venue where we had our deposit down. A restored farmhouse in Connecticut we'd put $1,500 on to hold our Saturday in September. I explained the situation as briefly as I could. The woman who answered was kind. She said they could apply the deposit toward a future booking. I said no thank you, please cancel it. Then I called the photographer, then the caterer, then the florist we'd visited twice in Brooklyn, then the DJ we'd met at a bridal fair in February, the one who'd played us a sample of his ceremony set. While my fiancée gripped my arm and said, this is the one. Every call felt like pulling something out of my chest. But after each one something else happened. Something settled. Not peace, exactly. More like finding a floor underneath everything. Solid ground. I moved what was mine out of our joint savings account. Only what I had contributed. The money I had been setting aside since last spring for a honeymoon in Kauai. The down payment share I'd transferred in after the house offer. I moved it to a new account at a different bank and withdrew the house offer the same afternoon. I sent one email to our guests. I kept it short. The wedding has been canceled. I apologize for any inconvenience with travel or lodging arrangements. Thank you for your understanding. I signed my name and clicked send. I knew what would follow. I was not wrong. Her mother called, her sister called, her cousin who'd already bought a bridesmaid dress called, my aunt called. Friends I hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Somehow had my number and used it. Then, my mother called. She didn't start with "Are you okay?" She started with, "She's devastated." I said, "I know what she is, Mom." She said, "She just needs time to work through her feelings about this." Something inside me went flat. I asked, "Did you know about Tyler?" A pause. She mentioned she was feeling conflicted. That someone from her past had gotten back in touch. I told her to be careful. That was the moment I understood something about how alone I had been in all of this. My own mother had known. Not the full picture. Maybe, but enough. Enough that she could have said something to me, and she hadn't. Because she was keeping the peace. Because she assumed it would sort itself out, because she believed the wedding would happen and whatever this was would quietly disappear on its own. Everyone had been managing the situation. Nobody had been honest with me. I told my mother I loved her. And that I wasn't able to keep talking about this. She started to say something else and I hung up. But then there was Dex. That one broke me open in a different way. When I found out by accident. A week after the breakup I was at a bar with 2 coworkers after a long Friday. One of them mentioned they'd run into Dex the previous Saturday. The Saturday when Dex had told me he was visiting his brother upstate. He hadn't been upstate. He'd been at a rooftop thing near the river. With Tyler. I texted him that night, just one line. Did you know Tyler was back? 3 minutes passed. Then, I heard something a few months ago. I didn't know how serious it was. How long ago? A longer pause this time. Like 2 months before she told you. 2 months. Before I'd submitted the offer on the house. Before we'd driven to Connecticut to walk through the farmhouse venue. Before she had sat across from me in our apartment and asked me to put my entire life on hold. Dex had known for 2 months. He called instead of texting back. I didn't pick up. I didn't reach out to him again after that, not for a long time. That was the loneliest part of the whole thing, if I am being completely honest. Not her. Not the canceled wedding, not the withdrawn house offer, not the boxes I spent a Sunday packing up and leaving stacked by the door for her to collect. It was that the person I had called first, the person I was certain was entirely in my corner, had been something back and decided to let me walk forward blind. I tell people about what she did, and they say they're sorry. When I get to the part about Dex, they go quiet differently. There's a particular silence for that kind of thing. Not dramatic, not explosive, just the specific quiet of someone realizing that the failure wasn't only where they thought it was. I threw myself into work, not as a strategy, more as the only thing left to pour myself into. I was a structural engineer at a mid-size firm that handled commercial and residential development across the metro area. I had been good at the job for years, reliable in the way I had been reliable everywhere. And for the past couple of years I had coasted slightly. Left at 5:30. Let others carry the harder proposals. Preserved energy for a personal life that had now fully disappeared. That spring and summer I had no personal life, so I worked. I stayed late. I took on a project nobody else wanted, a mixed-use development on a brownfield site on the west side that required creative structural solutions. And an almost absurd amount of patience with the city's permitting process. I spent 3 months on it. I called in favors from consultants I had relationships with. I brought in a specialist on my own dime to review my calculations. We won the contract. It was the largest project our firm had signed in 4 years. My director, a woman named Harriet, who had been in the industry for 30 years and did not hand out compliments, called me into her office. She said, "I don't know what happened to you this year, but whatever it is, you should figure out how to keep it." She offered me a senior associate position. More responsibility. A raise that was not insignificant. The kind of move I had been gradually working toward, and then gradually stopped working toward. I said yes before she finished the sentence. That evening, I went for a run along the waterfront for the first time in months. The city in October has a particular quality of light. That gold gray that makes everything feel like the last good afternoon of something. I stopped at a bench near the water and caught my breath. I almost texted her. That is the part they don't warn you about. Grief has no interest in your logic. My hand reached for her name, the way you reach for a light switch in a room you no longer live in. Pure reflex. She had been the person who heard my good news for nearly 5 years. My nervous system hadn't received the update yet. I stared at her name in my contacts for maybe 30 seconds. Then I put the phone in my pocket and ran home. Around Thanksgiving, her sister sent a text. "I hope you're doing okay. I want you to know I never thought what she did was right. I appreciated it." I didn't respond. In December, her mother left a voicemail. I listened to it once. She said my name carefully, the way you say a name when you're not sure you still have the right to use it. She said her daughter wasn't doing well. That the situation with Tyler had ended badly. That her daughter was staying with them now, and kept asking about me. She said she didn't know exactly what she was asking. She just thought I should know. I sat with that voicemail for a day. I didn't call back. What people who haven't been through something like this don't fully understand is that someone else's unhappiness is not automatically your responsibility to fix. I was not cold for knowing that. It was simply true she had made a choice, with full knowledge of what it meant. Tyler had been a test she'd designed for herself and he had failed it. And now the experiment was over, and the results were in. That was not my problem. It was just the truth. 3 weeks before Christmas, my building's front desk called up, while I was working late on a deadline. The security officer said there was a woman in the lobby, who said she was an old friend. The way he said it told me, he didn't entirely believe that. I said, "Send her up." I don't know why I said it. Maybe I needed to see who she had become. Maybe I needed to find out who I had. She looked different. Smaller, somehow, though those weren't quite right. She was wearing a dark coat I had never seen before, and her hair was shorter. She had been crying recently, or the recent memory of it was still on her face. She said my name. Just that. I said, "Hey." She sat in the chair across from my desk without being asked. An old habit. She had always moved through my spaces like they were partially hers. I used to love that about her. I waited. She said I owe you an actual apology. Not an explanation, not a list of reasons. Just, I'm sorry. What I asked you to do was wrong. And you deserved none of it. I looked at her for a moment. This was different from the emails she had sent in the fall. The careful circular messages about how she hoped I was okay, how she understood if I was angry, how things had gotten complicated. Those had been written to manage me. This felt like she had run out of strategy. I said, "Thank you." She looked surprised, like she had been bracing for something else. I meant it. The apology was real. It didn't break me open or put anything back together. It was just a real thing she said. She said, Tyler wasn't who I thought he was, or maybe he was exactly who he always was, and I needed to find that out for myself. I nodded. What? She told me what happened. By month 3 he was borrowing money. By month 5, he had stopped coming home at predictable hours. There were other women. There was his work situation. He had told her he had a consulting business, and he didn't, not really, not in any functional sense. She had moved back to her parents' house. Poots. She said, I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I know I don't get that. I just needed to say sorry to your face. I needed you to know I understand what I did. I said, I believe you. She looked at her hands. Then she said, is there any chance? I know I have no right to ask, but is there any way we could? I said, no. Just that, not angry, not triumphant, just clear, the way a thing is clear when it's simply true. She nodded like she had been expecting it. Still, when it landed, it moved through her. She covered her mouth for a second, then dropped her hand. She said, you look good. I said, so do you. She said, you seem different. I said, I am. She stood. She got as far as the door. Then she turned back and asked me the question I had been waiting for her to ask, since she sat down. She asked, did you ever really love me? I thought about it for a real second. Not for effect, because it deserved a real answer. I said, I loved who I thought we were together. And I loved you enough to have married you, even if part of me had been quietly disappearing inside that plan, for longer than either of us noticed. She looked like she might say something. She didn't. I said, take care of yourself. You don't need me for that part. She left. I stood at my office window for a while after, watching the street below. The city in December at midnight has a particular kind of quiet, not empty, just reduced. The buildings, the amber light, the occasional cab moving through. I thought about the house in Westchester that some other couple was probably closing on right about now. I thought about the venue in Connecticut and whether they'd managed to rebook our date. I thought about Kauai, which I still hadn't been to, and was already thinking about for next fall. I thought about Dex. A few months earlier, I had run into him at a mutual friend's birthday. We hadn't spoken since the night I found out he'd known about Tyler. He'd tried to catch me in the hallway near the kitchen, and I had walked past him without slowing down. At some point that evening he had set a beer in front of me without saying anything. I had drunk it without saying anything. We didn't talk. But it was something. Some small first thing that might eventually lead to another small thing. I was still deciding what I wanted that to become. What I know now, and only know because of everything that broke, is that I spent 4.5 years being the person she could always count on. And there is nothing wrong with that. Reliability is not a flaw. Patience is not weakness. Showing up is not something to be ashamed of. But I had been doing it from the wrong place. I had been steady because I was afraid of what happened if I wasn't. Afraid she'd leave. Afraid of conflict. Afraid that asking for what I actually needed would make me difficult to love. So I made myself easy instead. I made myself into the path of least resistance. And then confused that with being a good partner. And someone who only ever has to reach for you when they need. You will never fully understand what you cost yourself to be there. I changed apartments in the spring. Got a place downtown, higher floor, better light, a kitchen I actually wanted to spend time in. I started running again. Real running, not the guilt-driven kind. I saw a therapist for 6 months. She was direct in a way I came to appreciate. She asked me once, about 3 sessions in, who were you before you became someone she could rely on? I didn't have an answer that day. I went home and thought about it for a week. I have one now. The night my fiancée came to my office, I finished my deadline and turned off my desk lamp. Sometime midnight. I stood at the window for a few minutes before heading down to the lobby. She had come looking for the man she left behind. The one who would have absorbed the hurt quietly. The one who would have waited by the door. The one who would have taken her back and called it forgiveness, and meant it as relief. That man had been gone for a while, before she ever walked out. And the one standing at that window in December didn't miss him at all.